Good morning. If everyone can take their seats, that'd be fantastic. I just have a few quick housekeeping announcements. Firstly, bathrooms. There are bathrooms on every floor. They're on the right-hand side of the building. On this level, they're through the cafe, straight on, and the same upstairs and downstairs. There's no fire alarm scheduled for today, so if you do hear alarm, please vacate the building. Please do not use the lift. There are two stairwells, one the one you came in on, and there's an alternative stairwell to the right-hand side of the building. The muster point is on the steps of the Clarendon building, which is the building opposite with the pillars. If you go out through the alternative staircase to the right, you'll have to turn round through Hertford Quad, turn round and to the front of the building. Please remember that this event is being filmed for our webcast. The audio will only be picked up by the microphones, and that is only happening in this room as well. So for speakers and those asking questions, please do use the microphones, and our microphones do have quite a narrow range, so speakers, please do face forward. That would be great. Please switch your phones off or onto silent, and if you do need Wi-Fi access and you haven't already got a code, please do see me at the back and I will give you the codes. Just a reminder as well, this is a non-smoking building, and we do have a hearing induction loop, so do see me if you need any information about that. Okay, I think that's everything. Thank you very much.
Very warm welcome to the Oxford Martin School and the launch of the Global Cybersecurity Capacity Building Centre. We're absolutely delighted you're all here, and especially you, Minister. Thank you very much for coming up today and honouring us with your presence. This is a very special day for the Oxford Martin School. I'm Ian Goldin, the director of the school, and very proud to be able to be hosting the Global Cybersecurity Capacity Centre and to be working with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and the many other partners that have made this possible, and of course with Professor Sadie Creese, who will be directing the centre, and the great team which we're assembling to manage this. This is indicative of the sort of activity that the Oxford Martin School is exactly created to establish. James Martin, who tragically died in June this year, initiated the school in order to deal with the greatest challenges of the 21st century. He wanted to get new ways of thinking into the university and into the public space, and also to create a transmission belt between universities and ideas and policy making. And what we have in the Global Cybersecurity Capacity Setting is exactly that. Great minds will come together to tackle one of the most intractable issues of the 21st century. Cyber has become the new nervous system, and if we don't get this right, we really do have a prospect of a collapse of many of the achievements that have been fought for, thought for, and worked over for so many decades now. We have a magnificent system that can create a new renaissance of thinking in the world, bringing people together, establishing global commerce, establishing global ideas exchanges in ways which were unimaginable only 20 or 30 years ago. But the robustness and resilience of the system depends desperately on our ability to manage this challenge. So it could be seen as one of the greatest challenges of the early 21st century, and for that reason I'm absolutely delighted that the UK government has decided to place its support for this activity in the Oxford Martin School and at Oxford University. I'm delighted as well to have the Vice-Chancellor of the University, Professor Andrew Hamilton, here to take forward the proceedings. Professor Hamilton.
Ian, thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, it's an enormous pleasure for me to welcome you to and to open this Global Cybersecurity Capacity Centre that we're here to celebrate today and to focus on. It's also a particular delight to welcome you to this newly renovated, the former Indian Institute, but now the home of the Oxford Martin School. And you can see, really reflecting the importance of the Oxford Martin School to the life of the university. It's right at the heart of Oxford University, right? I often think that this crossroads, Broad, Cat Street, Holywell and Parks Road, This is the intellectual crossroads of the world. Anyone who engages in any kind of serious intellectual activity comes to Oxford, and they spend a great deal of time at this crossroads. It has this Oxford Martin School, All Souls and Hertford Colleges behind us. The Clarendon Building and the Bodleian Library is on the other side, and just in that corner will be the new Western Library, the old New Bodleian, going to be the home of our ancient, our magnificent collection of manuscripts and documents. It's the intellectual crossroads of the world, and of course, being in England, it also has a pub on the fourth quadrant, a vital part of that activity. And I want to also just make mention on this morning of Jim Martin. This topic in this school would have been enormously pleased Jim. It would have been exactly the kind of topic that he would have wanted the Oxford Martin School to be taking a lead on. We miss him greatly, but his vision, his generosity, and the energy that he brought to the Oxford Martin School is seen in the presence of all of you today, is seen in the emphasis on cybersecurity that is now taking place in the school. And as you look around Oxford and see these beautiful buildings that have been part of this great university for 900 years, you can sometimes think that this is a university that is, yes, ancient, yes, beautiful, yes, very proud of its traditions, but it's also a university that is a very modern, a very busy, a very focused, and a very relevant university for the 21st century. And that's shown very much by the focus that the university takes on many of those issues that are prominent in the 21st century. As long ago as 2001, Oxford University established the first institute focused on the internet, the Oxford Internet Institute. It was formed through the support of HEFGE and philanthropic support from Dame Steve Shirley. And already, now heading towards 15 years ago, we were focusing on the societal impact and the challenges presented by the internet. And of course, we can even take in Oxford some credit for the internet itself, because it's one of our own graduates, Tim Berners-Lee, who played such an important part in its development. Our Department of Computer Science has long been at the forefront of research and training in computing. It's considered to be one of the leading computer science departments in the world. Now, as Ian has said, cybersecurity gets to the heart of everything we do in the modern world, in our online environments, in the digital economy. It's not just about our bank accounts and social interactions, as we have been reminded so vividly in these past few weeks. But cybersecurity now assumes a much more central position in terms of both national and international security. And such issues are of immense concern, both for individuals and for the collective, and certainly for governments around the world. Cybersecurity and cyberspace are very much facts of life in the context of modern society, but they cannot be addressed purely with a national perspective. Cyberspace is global, and that is why the centre, the Cybersecurity Centre that we're celebrating here today, is seeking to engage with the international community. And we know from our own experiences, we know from our knowledge of cyberspace that every aspect of humanity is expressed within it. Hence, it is only natural that a university like Oxford University, so rich in the sciences, but with such a long tradition of excellence in the humanities and in the social sciences, it's only natural that we should be interested in the intellectual challenges associated with cybersecurity. And these challenges cannot be addressed by any single discipline, nor can we successfully effect change by acting alone. It must not only involve leading academic minds, but also the custodians of cyberspace in all their forms across governments, industry, and civil society. Since Oxford launched its Cybersecurity Centre in March 2012 as a virtual organisation fostering collaboration across our schools and departments, the Centre for Cybersecurity has had many successes. In February 2003, we made cyber risk a core element of our MBA programme at the Said Business School, a genuine collaboration between business and computer science, the first of its kind in the world. And we plan to further develop our cybersecurity educational offerings to the business community. In October 2013, we opened our Centre for Doctoral Training in Cybersecurity, one of only 2 such centres in the UK. The first year of Common Education involves academics from the Department of Computer Science, the Oxford Internet Institute, the Said Business School, the Oxford Research Centre, the Oxford, E-Research Centre, and the Blavatnik School of Government. A remarkable set of collaborations across this great university. And we have numerous research programs in cybersecurity involving those schools and the centre, as well as others, such as the Mann Institute, the Mathematical Institute, Information Engineering, Politics, and International Relations. And I've been delighted to watch over these past months other master's programs delivering leading education in cybersecurity, such as the MSc in Software and Systems Security, and for several years, the MSc in Social Science of the Internet. So it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome all of you to our latest endeavour in this world, the Global Cybersecurity Capacity Centre, which is based here in the Oxford Martin School. The centre and the focus, its principal focus, will be on furthering knowledge on how to deliver effective cybersecurity, including the devising of cyber policy and cyber defence, encouraging responsible cyber culture within society, building cyber skills into the workforce and leadership, and creating effective legal and regulatory frameworks. And in that way, helping us control the risks to society through technology and through new processes. We are working with leading thinkers from across the globe, and many of you are attending today. We thank you, and we very much look forward to the stimulating and the inspirational debate that will go on today and over the coming months. And as part of that debate, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome back to Oxford, his alma mater, a local MP, but also the Minister for Culture, Communications and Creative Industries, Mr. Ed Vaizey, who's kindly agreed to open this new centre and to start our discussions today. It must seem like an impossibly wide brief for our Minister, Culture, Communications and Creative Industries, but let me assure you, he's one who rose through student politics in Oxford, so he's very used to a very broad role of this kind, and for our part, the authorities of Oxford University will try hard not to hold his past against him. Minister.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here in Oxford for the opening of the Global Cyber Security Capacity Centre. As the Vice-Chancellor pointed out, I am from this university, and I hadn't quite realised as a student when I came here, and this was the history faculty, I used to come here for tea to meet my friends and then go across the road to the pub to meet some more friends, that I was actually at the crossroads of global intellectual endeavour. But I'm very pleased now that those days were indeed well spent and profitable, having tea and drinking beer, which is the core of the student experience at Oxford. But I think things have moved on since my day. But it is also the case, of course, that that is how you used to network in the pre-internet days. So I suppose it was important. It's only a year since the Foreign Secretary William Hague announced funding for a centre like this. He announced it at the conference in Budapest, which is part of the London process that he kicked off some time ago with our conference in London on cyber security. And William Hague, as you know, has put cyber security and cyber issues really at the heart of his foreign policy strategy. And his aim in putting forward this funding was to improve the impact, the scale and the pace of global cyber security capacity building. That is, capacity building in countries all over the world. And given that he only announced the funding a year ago, I think we've come a long way. Oxford won the bid, and obviously listening to Andrew, you will know why Oxford won the bid. It was clearly a slam dunk from the very start in April this year, and that's only 6 months ago. From that time, the Global Cybersecurity Capacity Centres had to recruit researchers, establish working groups, build a benchmarking model, engage with the international community. And in fact, they were even present at the Seoul conference that I went to with William and indeed Francis Maud, the Minister for Cybersecurity, last month to help represent British cyber capability on the global stage. So work is going on at a breakneck pace, and even today at this conference, we're also designing the logo at the same time. So we're really multitasking. It's really showing the way forward in terms of multitasking. So now the real work begins. Cyber threats are diverse, they're unpredictable, they're often anonymous, they come from organised criminals based in another continent or from a teenage computer hacker working from a bedroom closer to home. And the problem, of course, is always growing. In the last few months alone, 3 million customers had their personal information stolen through a sophisticated attack on Adobe's source code. Twitter, Associated Press, Reuters have also come under coordinated attack recently. And in the UK, we're acutely aware that cybersecurity and economic growth are inextricably linked. It's always hard to determine precise figures, but annual losses to UK businesses do run into the many billions of pounds, and that's a price that we shouldn't be paying. We are a pioneering nation. We are a nation full of consumers who are early adopters of technology. We were early adopters of e-commerce, but at the heart of the future of e-commerce obviously lies trust in the security that surrounds it. Security matters, and everyone has to play their part in working together, whether that's business, government, or indeed the consumer. So in the UK, trying to match Andrew's litany of success stories from Oxford University, let me tell you also what the government has been doing as well on the cyber security front line, as it were. We launched the Cyber Security Information Sharing Partnership. That's where government, along with industry partners, can exchange information on cyber threats and vulnerabilities as they occur. That's an absolutely vital organisation for dialogue and sharing information. We've also put at the heart of the new National Crime Agency a National Cyber Crime Unit. And you would have seen the remarks recently from senior police officers about how much more seriously they are going to take cyber crime. And of course, we're establishing a new National Computer Emergency Response Team, CERT UK, to improve national coordination of cyber incidents. Next month, we'll see the second anniversary of our government paper Cyber Security Strategy. So we'll use that to update Parliament on the progress we've made against the priorities we set then. That's the work undertaken through more than £850 million worth of investment in the National Cyber Security Programme to improve our cyber security capability. Of course, I don't need to tell this audience, I don't need to tell really the man in the street. The internet is global, and so cybercrime isn't an issue that we can solve on our own within our own borders. And the total independent nature of cyberspace means that it's absolutely vital that we pool resources internationally. That also means helping other nations improve their standards, because all states have an interest in having the skill and capacity to tackle cybercrime threats and increase the resilience of their networks. But there are also massive challenges in that, because all countries are striving to build their own capacity. That's a challenge for themselves. They don't necessarily have the time to think about supporting others. So actually, the gap is in the global capacity for cyber capacity building. And at the same time, there's no existing model or pattern of cooperation that we can simply take off the shelves. There's not a clear route map laid out for us to use, so this centre is breaking new ground. So I'm delighted that we are committing £2 million every year through the National Cybersecurity Programme for the establishment of this capacity building fund, not only including the creation of the Global Cybersecurity Capacity Centre and the UK Government Cybercrime Training of Partners overseas, which over the summer was instrumental in the arrest of a major e-fraud network based in Southeast Asia. The UK is home to 4 universities in the world's top 10, 6 of them in the top 20. I was delighted to hear earlier about how Oxford University is now, I think, ranked 3rd in terms of computer science and ranked 1st outside North America in terms of computer science. So we're immensely proud of our higher education institutions in the UK, and we're very pleased that actually 11 UK universities have now been awarded Academic Centre of Excellence status in cybersecurity. So we want to use this initiative to share our expertise with international partners, as well as learning from their experience too. And we particularly, of course, want to tap into Oxford's academic excellence and reputation for innovation. The Oxford Martin School is a fantastic achievement, and hearing Ian talk about Jim Martin's contribution and how he made this happen, it really is extraordinary. And it already is working to help tackle some of the greatest global challenges of the 21st century through cross-cutting research. And I was saying earlier that it could perhaps be a model as well for 21st century government. I think one of the big frustrations in government is that one is always working in silos and working, as it were, to a departmental agenda instead of working to solve a particular problem or task that is presenting itself. And that's why I think the Oxford Martin School impressed with its vision for adding structure and scientific rigour into this area through the proposed creation, through open sourcing and application of a benchmarking tool aimed at nation states. It's a great foundation, but ultimately the success of the centre will be measured not by its outputs, but actually by the impact it has on the organisations it's working with. I know that today there'll be a great debate on some of the key issues, and can I say as well that it's great to see representatives from all over the world, from the USA, from South Africa, from Brazil, from Korea, as well as private sector partners and international organisations. And that's how it should be. The multi-stakeholder approach that I advocate for internet governance should be adopted when it comes to internet issues, with governments, businesses and NGOs all pulling in the same direction and working together. 2 billion people are currently connected to the internet. It's transforming people's lives. I am proud, as I said earlier, that the UK is one of the most digitally advanced nations in the world, and I'm very proud that through the Global Cybersecurity Capacity Centre, the UK will play a leading international role in this important aspect of the internet. So I'm delighted to declare the centre officially open. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, Vice-Chancellor and Director. That brings us to the inaugural conference of the day. I'd be delighted to welcome to the front Professor Ivan Toft, who's going to chair our first discussion. He will be joined by Dr. Jamie Shear, Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO, Dr. John Lindsay, Researcher at the Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation at UC San Diego, USA. And whilst you're seating yourselves, so thank you all for being here. We are tremendously excited. We've constructed the programme for the day based on 2 fundamental observations. Firstly, that a centre of this nature, housed in a university of this type,
should not be scared to grapple with the more thorny issues of cybersecurity capacity building that we face globally. But we want to do so in an environment where we can each share our opinions and agree to differ with mutual respect. So we welcome as much contribution from the floor as possible. This is not just about sitting and listening to the great speakers that we have lined up for you today. Very much the speakers are here to stimulate debate, and there will be roving microphones and plenty of opportunity for you to express your opinions. I want to remind you all that we are webcasting live. We do have people joining us from other parts of the world, but we won't be webcasting outside of this room. So feel free to huddle in corners over coffee. There's plenty of opportunity for networking outside of this room too. And with that, in order to stay on time, I'm going to hand over to Professor Toft.
Good morning. I'm going to just deliver my talk from down here rather than stand up, and I'll let the speakers choose where and how they want to make their own panel presentations. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm very pleased that you're all here, that you've come, and that we get to talk about what the first panel is about, which is to what degree culture is a challenge to global collaboration on cybersecurity capacity building. And again, the Minister and the Vice-Chancellor and others have made really clear that it's very difficult in cyber to imagine making progress on anything as an individual nation, no matter how powerful you are as a state. So collaboration is almost built into what we need to do, and collaboration then means all kinds of difficulties, right? Now this is just one category of difficulties, and the procedure this morning is I'm going to just briefly introduce a few notes about culture, about how we think of it as social scientists and how it intersects with cyber, how I imagine it does. I'll briefly introduce our two distinguished panelists, our speakers. They'll each speak for about 10 minutes. I will try and keep everybody on time. And then the best part is we have questions from the floor and comments from the floor, which we very much welcome. All right, so what do we mean by culture? It's funny because when you think about culture, it's something that sort of dropped out. In my line of work, I'm an international relations and security academic. In my line of work, culture's mysteriously disappeared from social science and other analyses of international politics. Sometime in the 20th century, it disappeared. It wasn't acceptable or interesting for social scientists to use culture as a variable or to think about culture in any sort of meaningful way. And so it just sort of disappeared. And anybody who's read books from the 19th century, you can't crack a spine without coming across culture in some aspect, right? And it seems to me that the reintroduction of culture as an important issue of concern in our line of work really dates from the 1990s, the early 1990s, and in particular the efforts of one man, formerly probably the most famous political scientist in the United States, a man named Samuel S. Huntington, who penned a sort of policy brief in a policy journal called Foreign Affairs called The Clash of Civilizations in 1992. And he imagined civilization as a term that's an aggregation of culture, and then began setting about trying to sort of demarcate where cultures began and end, and then start to trace out some of the political and conflict implications of the fact that the world seemed to be lumping into culture. So there's an Islamic culture, according to him. There's a Western culture. There are Asian cultures, and so on. And then this led to a series of debates about where cultures begin and end and who gets to decide. But anyway, this then makes it acceptable to reintroduce culture into our discussions. And why that's important is because if you do read in the 19th century, you realize that the obsession with culture was not culture per se, but was about hierarchies of culture. Whose culture was superior, whose culture was inferior, right? The new modification, or the new entrance of culture into our discussion, is really sort of ends at differences and then traces implications. It's not obsessed with high culture, low culture, and this sort of thing, right? So that's a sort of preamble or background to this discussion today, because we realize that when you think of security, when you think of cybersecurity, you're really also talking about what security invokes, which is some sort of a threat. Why would we need security if there wasn't a threat, if there wasn't some danger out there? And then the question is, and this is what I want to sort of end my sort of preamble with before the introductions is, how do we define threats? Is there some sort of, you sort of open a book and there it is and everyone agrees on exactly what a threat is? Do cultures actually mediate what a threat counts as? And if so, does that imply obstacles to global collaboration on cybersecurity and different conceptions of what building cybersecurity capacity might mean? okay? That's point one. Point two is if they do, what do we do about them, right? For those of you who've, there are a number of old quotes here, and I won't go into too many of them, but this one, the old aphorism, nature abhors a vacuum. Well, for social scientists, and in particular anthropologists, nature also abhors a monoculture, right? And one of the things we're worried about is we want to preserve a cyberspace and a cybersecurity capacity that doesn't demand that we all have the same sort of culture or we all have the same sort of approach to cyber. We want a place where there's a sort of big tent where we can all achieve meaningful security without necessarily implying that everybody has to have the same impression or the same idea about everything. And that, by the way, is going to be very difficult. If you talk to the Russians, you talk to the Iranians, you talk to the Chinese, you talk to them about what security is, and then you talk to somebody from Britain, from New Zealand, or from Japan, you get, the word is the same, here's threat, but their deeper understanding of what threat means, and then the implication that follows what security means, are apt to be quite different, okay? And since we need collaboration, we need cooperation to get collaboration, that turns out to be a really interesting question, and I'll leave it as a question. All right, allow me to introduce our speakers then. To the far right, we have Dr. John Lindsay. He's a researcher at the Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation at UC San Diego. Dr. Lindsay is doing fascinating work on information technology and security, which goes a lot deeper and broader writ than just simply culture. His presentation today is bound to be exciting and interesting. And I have it penned in here, but this is a moving target. I have it penned in here as East-West differences and opportunities. But I think that the target being moving so much, we're apt to get something fascinating, but it may not actually be related to that. Then to my immediate right is Dr. Jamie Shea, who is, as you've already heard, Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO. And his talk is Building a Cooperative Network for Cybersecurity, a NATO Perspective. Now I'm particularly honored that both of them came, but if you think of NATO and you think of NATO's history, it's a perfect sort of prologue for exactly what I'm talking about, because 200 years ago, getting the idea of Europeans to think of themselves as Europeans would have been ridiculous. Belgians were Belgians, French were French, Germans were Germans, and the idea of a European shared identity or a European culture would have been preposterous, okay? Here we are all these years later, we've faced a number of challenges on exactly this issue of security, and so I'm sure that Dr. Shea is going to have some interesting sort of remarks on that respect. All right, that's all I have. Do we know what order we want to go in? Why don't we start with Dr. Shea and then go to Dr. Lindsay?
Okay, dear Professor, thanks for the nice introduction. Like the Sundance Kid, I prefer to deliver standing up. I was also at this august university back in the Middle Ages. I studied French literature. If I'd realised that I'd had to one day tackle cyber defence, I would have rapidly changed course, but too late now. When I speak on cyber, many of my colleagues at NATO remind me of what the poet Shelley said of Lord Byron, that he'd lost, unfortunately, the gift of communication, but not the art of speaking. But I'll do my best. First of all, as is always pointed out, we face a challenge that the internet, of course, started out with nobody thinking of security in mind. Quite the opposite. It was designed specifically to be an anti-security medium, to be a domain of freedom, of fun, of anarchy. And now that we recognize the importance of security, 30 years on, we have to sort of see to what degree we can sort of retrofit it or retro-engineer it into the system in a way, of course, that does not throw the proverbial baby out with the bathwater, which does not kill the golden calf, which is increasingly, as was said by the minister, providing the connective tissue for all that we do in the world today, a fantastic means of human communication, a fantastic means of empowering civil society, a fantastic means of spurring economic development. I mean, McKinsey Global Studies Institute sort of does regular analyses of this and has shown that, for example, in many of the industrialized countries, it adds possibly 3%, 3-4% of GDP over a given year period. I was recently at a meeting at the World Bank where we heard about the way in which the internet, mobile phones, social media is empowering women, empowering farmers, empowering microcredit, and is probably one of the most important spurs also to economic development. Yet we also, of course, are going towards now the Internet of Things, where more and more of our business, more and more of our identity, more and more of our data is going online. And that by the end of this decade, we'll have an Internet of Things with 15 billion devices in the world, all increasingly interconnected. About 55 million different functions will be connected to the Internet. The Internet is increasingly going to go from linking up the logical world to the physical world and to the social world. More and more of our lives, whether we like it or not, will go on into the Internet. There may even be a price for not being ready to divulge your data or your identity. Not participating could become not an opt-out, but a form actually of positive social discrimination. So we increasingly therefore realise that whereas climate change is about if we are going to survive the 21st century, the Internet is perhaps not quite as serious as that, but it's certainly going to determine the quality of our lives, our prosperity, and how we're going to live in the future. Now, from a security point of view, as we look at this whole problem of how do we make the Internet a more secure medium, how do we enhance the trust, how do we encourage its use, that we have to first of all figure out what do we mean by security online. And particularly as we realise that the Internet today is more or less the equivalent of the spinning jenny at the beginning of the 19th century, which was the beginning of the industrial age, which was going to go much farther. And so we are here there. And how do we get it right so that we don't, as I say, come up with the wrong model that first of all is going to waste a lot of time, effort and money not solving the problem, but secondly is not going to give us the solution we need. And I think the first thing that we have to note in that respect is that the traditional model of physical security that I, for example, in NATO, during my career, have grown up with, isn't going to work, which is the traditional model that you can deter attacks through declaratory policy or by having a posture of your own. For example, you can use a device like Stuxnet, absolutely. We know now what some of the more sort of powerful malware can do. But even that is not necessarily going to prevent your own grid being attacked. So there's no longer the same sort of equivalence that we've grown up with between the actions that you carry out and being able to diminish or reduce or change the nature of attacks against you. Secondly, you used to sort of basically know who was attacking you, and at least it made it easier to know how to deal with that real or potential attacker. You understood the direction of attack. You could measure, if it did happen, what the impact would be, what the damage would be, how long it would take you to recover. And you, knowing the threat, you had a more or less good idea about how much you wanted to invest in defence. How much is enough? What do I need to do? What are the risks associated with certain levels of defence? I think the problem is that the Internet has destroyed all of these traditional assumptions of what protection, what security is all about. If a CEO today spends 10 times more on the security of his IT, does he really think that he's getting 10 times more security? Does he know if he's made the right investments? I think one of the problems here is that unlike traditional military domains, we totally lack a base of evaluation of vulnerabilities, of capabilities and threats. A lot of the time we don't know if we're being attacked. It's one of the phrases that you hear percolating around this milieu is there are two types of CEO, the one who knows that his systems have been penetrated and the one who doesn't know it yet. And if we lack a baseline for actually knowing how good our security is, it's very difficult to know how much we need to improve. That doesn't exist in governments, it doesn't really exist in the military field either, and it certainly does not exist in the private sector. I think one of the early tasks for this centre here would be to try to establish a methodology which would be universally acceptable on what are the metrics, what is the baseline for being able to analyse the state of your systems and how do you measure the impact of attacks. We don't even know what the cost of attacks are. In terms of impact. Sometimes these can fluctuate wildly, and if a CEO is not able to measure the impact or the cost of an attack, he probably doesn't know how much risk he can afford to take with defence. So first of all, we have to rethink security. We cannot carry on trying to build a bigger and bigger firewall, rather like a moat or a wall around a castle around an ever-increasing amount of data. The expansion of data is simply exponential and incredible, and it's probably going to continue. For example, just one Reaper aircraft, a drone, on one single flight mission collects more data than all of the downloads from the internet in a single week. Companies are now adding every year 28,000 times more data that is contained in the entirety of the US Library of Congress. Even Facebook registers 82 billion new entries every day of the week. So again, a second task, I think, for this school is to define what do we actually need to keep. How do we sift the data? How do we stop it all going into one single pot? So if we lose something, we lose everything because of the connectivity. How do we start to segregate? How do we establish risk vis-a-vis different types of data? And not try to build one firewall, but build several in a variegated system. The second issue, of course, that's come up is how do we provide the security among ourselves? Now, here, the classical problem, and this goes to what you were saying, Professor, about culture a moment ago, is that we all come at this from stovepipes. The Minister was saying it. Governments tend to obviously focus first and foremost on their own systems, the systems that enable their functionality. The Pentagon focuses, first of all, on the defence contractors and the critical technologies that supply the armed forces, or the needs of the intelligence community. At the moment, there is an increasing call from the business sector to government to say, well, don't just worry about the critical infrastructure or critical technologies, but worry too about our intellectual property protection, on which economic health depends. As calculations show, for example, that intellectual property can be worth 45 to 75% of the value of a company. So how do governments take on not simply a responsibility to protect their own systems, but an increasingly societal mission to take care of the welfare of their companies and citizens as well? Companies too, and I'm no doubt you'll spend a lot of time and effort in the years ahead on this, also have to learn too to overcome certain traditions about proprietary information. Only 1% of attacks are currently owned up to or advertised. Much of the information exchanges in very small, very confidential networks. That's very useful, but it doesn't go outside. How do, therefore, we get, not only between governments and companies, but among companies themselves, a greater willingness to share and assist each other, but again, without coming up against the idea that if I own up to something and my competitor company announces it, I'm at an immediate competitive disadvantage. And then thirdly, the academic role, which has been pointed out. How do we increasingly get the academic community to help us to identify the critical policy choices before it's too late to make them, quite frankly, while we still have time, and to understand the evolution of the internet in the future. And also, of course, to provide the expertise, which is often lacking in being able to run it. Finally, because you're looking at me, which means my 10 minutes are up, the third issue, of course, is what kind of coalitions are going to serve us well. Well, it's not going to be easy, frankly, and that's why you're needed here, this centre, to build these coalitions. For example, just in NATO alone, we have big debates whether Article 5 collective defence or solidarity should apply in the cybersphere, as logically you would expect that solidarity to apply in the event of a missile attack or a conventional armed attack with tanks and troops. If one country suffers, like Estonia in 2007, but the neighbours are pretty okay, is there a need for assistance? This, again, is not quite clear. To what degree should the expertise that's been developed in the military sphere be made more broadly available to the civilian sector? What is fair burden sharing in the cyber world? If one ally has spent once at home on expensive cyber defence technologies, should that ally spend twice to assist the other allies to come up to certain minimal standards? Should we sort of make cyber fit the existing parameters of the institution, or do we have to change the institution to fit the parameters of the cyber challenge? So this is a difficult exercise. But my final point is that we cannot wait. We cannot wait before we have solved all of these difficult conceptual issues regarding cyber defence before we start building international cooperation. If we wait until we think we've got the solution or we've got the philosopher's stone and then start reaching out to others, it's going to be too late. So we have to sort of work on the two layers, the two levels at the same time. What can NATO do? Exercises. We have one at the moment called Cyber Coalition going on in Estonia, where we can test methodologies and test systems against a range of different attacks. And we do these not just with NATO allies, but with partner countries as well. Second thing, methodology. We have worked in NATO on a very well-tested system to be able to help one organisation or one country identify the critical networks in neighbouring countries of which it depends for its vital functions. That's not easy, identifying on what other systems you may depend and then testing to what degree those protocols are adequate. We can start with standards, putting around the alliance, the minimum standards that countries need to adhere to if they are to be able, politically and technically, to receive assistance from allies in a crisis as well. And of course, lessons learned and best practices through the Centre of Excellence that we have in Tallinn, which is also, as you know, with the Tallinn Manual, recently worked on the international legal aspects. And finally, partnership. I mentioned partners. If you take the 28 countries that NATO is working with in Afghanistan today, with a common Afghanistan mission sharing network and a common cyber defence protection in the field, and you take that type of community then to develop best practices and sharing and trust in the cyber domain, that's not the whole world, but it's 1/3 of the world. And therefore it starts setting in practice a set of arrangements and standards which hopefully then become the gold standard for the rest of the world to follow. So in short, 10 minutes are up. World Wide Web requires worldwide solution. We need to sort out what we need. How do we incentivize our partners to be willing to share and to cooperate with us? What are the carrots? What are even the sticks? Do we go for formal arrangements like treaties, or is it best to go for informal arrangements? Where do we need governments to intervene, but where can private networks, institutions, companies, civilians also take the lead? The one thing, though, is that we need to play catch-up. In all security, there is a lag between the evolution of the problem and the threat and finally the solution becoming available. The problem in the cyber world is that that lag is now running at about 30 years. The problem is that the evolution of the problems are still running much faster than our ability to catch up. We can catch up, but it's going to take a major effort. And again, I'm very happy to pledge NATO's full and active cooperation to the work of the Centre as it develops. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to be here today.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to have the opportunity to speak to you. I've got 10 minutes to talk about East-West cultural differences and opportunities, so we should be able to breeze right through that. It's kind of a daunting topic, so I'll try and simplify it a little bit and talk just about China and the United States. So 10 minutes, here we go. The question, can culture explain cybersecurity? It is tempting perhaps to look at a simplistic view where we have an Eastern Confucian collectivist culture, and on the West we have a Western liberal individualistic culture, and perhaps this might help to explain the preference for internet sovereignty on the one side, heavy statist emphasis on cooperation among states in the United Nations to organize the internet, and on the other hand, the multi-stakeholder approach, which was explained earlier. That might get us a little bit of the way, but it might also hide some opportunities for interaction and understanding across this supposed divide. If I were just to ask everybody in this room what is cybersecurity capacity building, probably would get 100 different answers, and that's just in this room, let alone when we start looking across cultures. So my theme is that there's not just one East-West culture, there are multiple cultures in each country, and we need to learn how to work between and across those. Let's start first about China. Let's start first talking about China. China is one of the fantastically good news stories of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. In a mere 20 years, it has gone from a closed country, absolutely shattered by the Cultural Revolution, to the second largest economy in the world and catching up fast. Hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of grinding poverty and are now entering the modern world. So this is a really good news story. So the first of three cultural influences in China I want to talk about are these stunning liberal reforms that are ongoing but still quite imperfect. China has put a lot of effort into creating a legal infrastructure, and its politicians often refer to it. Of course, it's implemented in a very irregular fashion, and that's why we still have incredibly imperfect protection of intellectual property. Increasing privatization, of course, very incomplete, makes room for a lot of corruption and opacity between state-owned enterprises and the state. Growth continues to be a mixture of both state-led intensive capacity investment, perhaps overinvestment in many places, and sometimes potential for excessive protectionism of China's national champions. In the security debate, this is especially interesting because we have a lot of movements towards creating barriers that are based putatively on security, and there may be legitimate security concerns involved, but we also always have to ask to what degree are these set up to protect China's emerging industries as well. Lastly, within this bucket of categories, I just want to point to the large and growing vibrant internet population that China has. This is over 500 million people and growing on the internet to the degree that China does have a civil society. It's online, and it is a very feisty and active place. So when you look at all these developments and this growth that is ongoing, you have to recognize that the Chinese people are very creative and very pragmatic people. They recognize that the internet is key to their growth and their integration into the global economy. However, the Chinese government is a vestigial Leninist system. This is a party state, and it is an authoritarian state. However, it is a very fragmented authoritarianism in China. It is fragmented not just across the bureaucratic silos, which we've talked about here in the West, but across regions as well. So you have a very opaque bureaucracy, which is often opaque to the Chinese themselves. Inherited from this Marxist-Leninist background, you have kind of a big emphasis on ideological harmonization, where from the top, you'll have these bromides that'll come out. So, what do you think about the Deng Xiaoping 24 characters? What do you think about Jiang Zemin's 3 represents, or Xi Jinping's 6 focus on closely? And then you'll see these will circulate through, and the same kind of phrases will be repeated and unpacked. And it can be very difficult to understand what's going on, and sometimes if you speak to Chinese in private, you'll get a very different version of events. But it's important to appreciate the lasting influence that the Marxist-Leninist party culture has today on Chinese politics. Just to give you an example, those of you in the room here are probably familiar with the 2011 International Code of Conduct that Shanghai Cooperation Organization, particularly China and Russia, introduced. And this is kind of the first formal introduction of the idea of internet sovereignty. Well, the internet should be managed through the United Nations. This is not a new thing. If you look at the 1955 5 Principles of Peaceful Coexistence, also known as the Bandung Line, and this was kind of the basis for Maoist, if not foreign policy, at least the rhetorical presentation of foreign policy. It's got 5 points: an emphasis on territorial sovereignty, mutual non-aggression, non-interference in domestic affairs, equality amongst states, and peaceful coexistence. So if you look at the current debates on internet sovereignty, sounds new, sounds digital. There's at least 60 years of Chinese ideological background there. Of course, the imperatives of the Chinese Communist Party to stay in power makes a real focus on internet control, something that is important in China and obviously controversial in the West. Important in China because there's an obsession with foreign hostile forces, or the three evils of terrorism, splitism, and extremism that we look at as perhaps religious groups and dissidents. But because the internet is a global internet, those focuses on internal security can easily be externalized. I want to point out that when the Chinese talk about information security, it is a large concept that includes not only the technical control and defense against threats, but even more the control of the content of the internet. So much so that there is a new term that has gradually been emerging, network security, to contrast with information security. And I would argue that the Chinese have focused so much on information security that they have actually neglected network security. So when the Chinese talk about their systems being very insecure and under siege, they are not wrong. The next big trend that I want to focus on with China is obviously, the communist period of China's history is not that long in the sweep of its 2,000 to 5,000 year history, and the Chinese are rightfully proud of that. But that pride can cut both ways. Many Chinese feel that the last 100 years of humiliation by the West before the coming to power of the Communist Party, that 150 years is only now being rolled back, and China is being restored to its rightful place in the sun. Now, the Chinese are aware that this makes a lot of people in the West very nervous, which is why you've seen a big Chinese influence on soft power, a deliberate attempt to try and shape and promote a concept of Chinese culture which will not be threatening to the West. But again, this has been an ambiguous project. On the one hand, it has tried to reassure the West with concepts of China's peaceful rise, a harmonious society, or most lately, a new kind of great power relationship. But on the other side, there's been tendencies within this soft power promotion to talk about an alternative to the Washington Consensus, perhaps a state-led model of growth that is able to weather economic problems better than the West. There's also within Chinese culture a deep commitment to strategic realpolitik. This is the culture of Sun Tzu, after all. Alistair Ian Johnson at Harvard has described Chinese culture in terms of a cultural realism. So there is a deep commitment to looking at the world in terms of hard power and cold interests. Now, China's not the only one with multiple ways of parsing the world with cybersecurity implications. You can also look at the US or the West more broadly in three terms, and I'll go through these a little more quickly because I think they'll be familiar to this audience. First of all, obviously there's a big culture of economic liberalism. We see huge commercial opportunities in the internet and in engagement with China, and this creates movements towards engagement and the attempt to bring China and integrate it into the international community. At the same time, that same liberalism has a political valence which creates a little bit more friction, a desire to try and transform China into a more democratic society, criticism of China for its human rights, civil liberties, and state-run media abuses, and a willingness sometimes to intervene and to provide tools funded by the U.S. Department of State and other organizations in Europe to try and defeat or circumvent censorship. As you can imagine, this is looked at as a direct attack upon China's information security. There is, of course, a real strong realpolitik set of tendencies within both the U.S. and other countries in the West looking at China, and they say that China's increasing confidence is not just integrating into the world, but is making it more willing to experiment with revisionist tendencies in the region. So you see this sort of schizophrenic focus on both engaging and containing or balancing at the same time. And cyber is greatly feared to be part of China's general anti-access area denial set of capabilities that it's putting up in order to try and keep Western military power out of the region. So to close up real quick, I'd argue that this has three big imperatives for Chinese cybersecurity. At the first, there are strong incentives for the Chinese to exploit the internet aggressively. This is both on the military side, where you have a very insecure but growing Chinese military that looks at cyber as a set of asymmetric opportunities which might help to level the playing field against what they see as Western military forces that quite outmatch them. And number two, the economic opportunity, the theft of intellectual property to help China's economic growth. I talked a little bit about the information security, network security dilemma, so I think we've already gone into that. But I wanted to hit on this sense of deep vulnerability and insecurity that China feels, both in the cyber domain and in the military domain, which yes, they do look at it as an asymmetric threat. There's kind of these two threads in Chinese strategic thought, which might be contradictory. You could discuss that more. This sense of cyber as an asymmetric force leveler, but also a sense that, however asymmetric it might be, the United States, Great Britain are so much more advanced and so much more skilled at this domain that there's very little that China can do as long as it is open to the West to prevent exploitations of China's firms, China's government. This was a long-standing theme in China. The revelations of Edward Snowden made this all the more visible and pretty much undermined any moral standing that the West might have on trying to pick on China for espionage. The subtle distinction between commercial espionage and political espionage is lost quite easily when you look at the wealth of detail that Snowden has provided. So when you look at China's insecurity, their movement towards this normative sense of an internet sovereignty is in many ways a last resort. If we are unable technically to match the West on all these activities, let's at least try to talk about a way to normatively get these threats to stand down. So that's kind of a pessimistic picture, but I would say, just in closing, that there are really some opportunities here. If you look at the three categories I went through with each country, the big thing they had in common was this commitment to open, liberal development. A global integrated economy is absolutely fundamental, both to the East and the West. And I think that any cyber capacity that we look at needs to take that very seriously and look at pragmatic opportunities, not to talk about big differences between East and West, but look at specific details on how the internet and how trade policy is managed, where you can find consensus and the potential to grow. Secondly, on that same, because the utility of the internet is fundamentally in this integration. I mean, the internet has made China and the West richer than they would otherwise be. We need to make sure that any standards, any regulations that we impose don't undermine that fundamental wealth creation of the internet. So just to wrap up, one quick anecdote. We're finishing up an edited volume on China and cybersecurity. 1/3 of our authors are Chinese, and it was fascinating once we got the chapters back to look at these. And the Chinese chapters, which included one by a PLA general, were all fairly hopeful at the end. They talked about lots of possibilities for working together, for finding ways to work out. Our other two-thirds of our chapters from British, Canadian, and American authors were incredibly pessimistic. They pointed out all the conflicts of interest and all the reasons this couldn't happen, and just really, really grim. So I would just throw that out there, that when we think about the difficulties in international internet governance, we often hold up China as the bad guy, but maybe we've got that backwards, and there might be cause for hope and interaction.
All right, one of the invariable laws of panels is that they always go slightly over, but we're lucky because we only had 2 of the original 4 scheduled, so we're only 4 minutes behind now. I challenge the rest of the panels to stay on time as much. All right, but that means we've got still got plenty of time for discussion, for questions from the floor. I'll try and field the questions to either author. If we run out of time at the end, or if you're too shy and we run out of questions, I'll ask them. But if we run out of time at the end, then we'll aggregate and try and get as many in as possible. So this gentleman here first. Yes.
So, hello, I'm Gauss. I represent First here. First is organization. Sorry. Okay. Well, let's start again. I'm Gauss. I represent First. First is international organization that encompasses 300 plus certs. So basically, the guys who are handling incidents day in, day out. You said in your talk you were touching on information sharing. So, and I know that various governments, various organizations, they would like, and everybody is coming to us, well, to CERTS and asking, we want data, we want data, we want to learn what's going on. So my question to you is, why? Why do we need that data? Because up until now, the only reason I was given is to build a larger picture, which basically means we have no idea, but we want it. So why do we need it? And that is one of the reasons why nobody is giving data to anybody, basically. I mean, we are communicating, CERTs are communicating to each other, and we are sharing information, but we are not giving it away because we do not see reason why we should do it, because we are not getting anything from governments, especially. So, please.
That's a fair question. I think the governments do recognise, not all of them obviously, because we're dealing still, as said, with a very sort of fragmented picture, but the need to provide something in return. I mentioned incentivise. How do you not just force somebody to cooperate with you through directives or legislation? Sometimes the better approach is to make them want to do it voluntarily because they see an interest. And all of that is based on reciprocity. The first thing, I think, is that in the United States, for example, now you obviously see the big intelligence agencies, not just the NSA, being more prepared now to share what they're picking up regarding potential threats, attacks, intentions, and they've obviously got many good ways of finding these things out with critical private industries. So that's one incentive. And so that you have a system where what you're picking up from the intelligence community can be checked with what you're actually seeing technically on the web, a kind of correlation type of exercise. Secondly, of course, trying with critical private industries on which the governments depend to have a system of certification for minimum standards, for example, for power or for air traffic control systems or water, you know, the public goods, if you like, on which not just the health of the company, but all of us depend, and then confidential information sharing systems. This can be helpful if it's early. It also can help, for example, later on in terms of attribution, if you can capture the data in packages and then analyze it. Most hackers have some kind of tradecraft. Now, for example, in the nuclear field, if I can use an analogy, forensics have gone so far that you can more or less tell now where a particular sort of uranium isotope comes from. You can sort of analyze the DNA and with a certain reasonable confidence attribute that. What we need is a kind of cyber forensic system where we also then could be more, maybe not totally certain, but at least with enough certainty to be able to go to a government and say, look, we think it comes from there, please cooperate or whatever. And that can only come on the basis of sort of information sharing. Not only deals with incidents, but allows you over time to build up a kind of pattern of activity. So you recognize a certain sort of persistency of certain forms of behavior. So that would be my answer to you. But of course, the rules have got to be clear because companies will not share it if they feel that it could be used, obviously, with banks or whatever to compromise their business or to lead to great loss. But on the other hand, the vulnerability to cyber attacks has also led to many companies going bankrupt as well. So it can work the other way.
Yes, gentleman in the back.
Thank you. John Madeline, we've heard a lot about the geographic dimension to culture. There was a great term, lumpiness, across the geos, as well as the impact of accelerating economic transformation from China. But there's another accelerating dimension, and it's the impact of the next generation. And the next generation are accelerating in their uptake and their relationship with technology in a much more open, much more transparent way. There's a sense of a culture melt and a transparent society that's imminent. What does the panel think about that dimension in terms of cyber?
John, do you want to?
I actually think this relates to the first question about information. There's ambiguity when we talk about the threat, which we all perceive as increasing, but is it increasing in kind of an absolute sense? Is it really worse than it has been? It probably is, but with respect to what? This increasing uptake by both individuals, young folks, and corporations also points to the increasing digitization and in many ways increasing trust in the internet. So yes, that trust can be exploited, but I think recognizing that the benefits of the information revolution continue to expand. So I think the importance of having information is trying to understand, well, the threat is expanding, but is it expanding at a lower rate, the same rate as those benefits? If there really are market failures, how big are they? And if we don't have enough information to do the right kind of costs and benefits, then we might have an exaggerated notion of the threat, which would cause us to actually have regulations that could be far too austere and then undermine that uptake, which could be a very positive thing.
I think that what you've identified, sir, is probably, to my mind, the most critical social issue coming out of the internet, which of course comes to big data and the use of ever more sophisticated algorithms to sort of pull together massive amounts. You know, the IBM computer Watson in the last couple of years, as you know, sort of pulled together millions of medical records, epistemological studies, individual case histories, well beyond the capacity of the human brain to do predictive cancer analysis. Now, that could be a tremendous force for good. You know, for example, the Los Angeles City Police Department can use algorithms now to look at criminal records, trials, sociological issues, demographics, to sort of decide where in Los Angeles the crime is most likely to occur, and therefore to put sort of 80% of the police forces there rather than somewhere else. That again, in terms of efficiency of resources, could be a big thing. But it's increasingly leading to a situation where identity is becoming digitalized, you said that, and we have to decide, is this the future of humanity, that it's the end of privacy? As we have known it. For instance, recently at Harvard, there was I found an absolutely fantastic experiment where they looked at a number of anonymous people, hundreds of anonymous people who'd gone on the internet with anonymity to take part in a medical trial. And again, using algorithms on demographics, telephone numbers, addresses, locations, public records, they identified 97% of those people ultimately, proving that there is no anonymity with big data on the internet. So the question, of course, is this a kind of inevitable evolution? Marshall McLuhan called it the return to the tribal society, because in a tribal society, private identity, private life doesn't exist. One is a kind of public person advertising everything about themselves all the time on the internet, and therefore your data is not owned by you anymore. Who owns it? This is not quite clear. Or is there still time to figure out a way in which we can get all of these fantastic benefits of big data in sort of, breaking down data into packages to analyze a problem. It's I started out with systems analysis, and this is the dream of systems analysis, to find rational solutions to problems. Or are we going to a sort of a brave new Orwellian world where the internet becomes no longer a source of individual communication, but the biggest mass surveillance program ever invented? And again, this is what I think is going to be one of the critical issues where this news centre can provide answers. Certainly, I think it's the biggest issue on the agenda today, even bigger than the ones that I outlined in my speech.
Yeah, I'll just, before we get to the next, I just want to answer this in a different way, because I think that the youth culture, I remember being shocked. My nieces came out last summer to help us when we were traveling and to sort of be nannies. And what was really striking is when they go to sleep at night, they sleep with their phones next to their heads, right? And so it's not just that the uptake, it's almost in terms of habits of mind, right? This device then becomes an extension of you. And the question isn't how interesting that is, but how vulnerable that makes us in other ways, right? So for example, the New York Times last year had a lovely bit of research about our ability to think independently in the era where we all have mobile phones, right? So it used to be, in the old days, you'd go to the grocery store and you either had a list or you had to remember what you needed, right? You needed bananas, you needed bleach, you needed 4 other things. And you'd have to train your brain to remember these. It's like a little skill. The more you practice it, the better you get at these little short-term memory exercises. With a mobile phone, you don't need that. You can text your wife and say, was it bleach or bananas? I know it began with a B. What do we need? And she can text you right back almost in real time and say, it was bananas. And she might say something like, you idiot, or whatever at the end of it. But the point is that if you get accustomed to this, that skill that you had before of being able to remember things is both unneeded, and then it sort of falls away, right? And so this was the implication of the research, which is that we have already begun to make modifications in the way our brains work because of the assumption of having the device. So for cybersecurity, that's another aspect of it, is if the machine stops. One of my colleagues recommended this book by E.M. Forster, which was written in 1923, if you can imagine, with the same title, The Machine Stops, right? If the machine stops, how prepared are we to carry on, right? Just in simple tasks. And as we move forward in time with this, my niece is sleeping with these phones next to them with it's less about what's on the internet, but then the very fact of the way our brains relate to the technology that becomes a kind of a threat. If the machine stops, can we carry on? And of course, I think of this in the military aspect all the time. A few years ago, I was on the bridge of the U.S. aircraft carrier George Washington, and there were two shocks for me. I mean, not that I'm the world's greatest computer expert, but I was up on the bridge, and the skipper came up, and there was some workmen up there with welders, and they, with torches, and they were welding off this thing that looked like a multicolored Christmas tree, which was sticking out from the pilot's cabin, on the bridge. And I said, what is that? And he says that uses basically trigonometry. So when the pilot brings a giant ship into the port, he can look down and measure the angle for how close the ship is to the dock, so it doesn't actually crash into the dock. And he says, but we do it with lasers now, so we're getting rid of it, right? So they were moving this device because they're now going to be dependent on GPS and lasers to do the same thing. And the question that leaps to mind right away is, what if there's a bit of sand in your laser, right? And of course, that's not the end of the world. They crunch a dock or something like that. But the bigger shock was then the console at the center of the bridge of an American aircraft carrier has this little, almost like a trackball and a big screen. And on the screen was a screensaver that said, welcome to Windows, or something like that, Windows 2000 or something like that. I thought, really, an aircraft carrier running Microsoft software? This is not comforting. Sorry for any of you out here from Microsoft. This was years ago, right? I'm sure it's all been fixed by now. But just to give you an idea of how we integrate with technology, that seems to me to be the bigger issue moving forward. But it rides right along with things like what's on the internet and how, what information is appropriate and what isn't. And I also just wanted to interject a note on culture and cameras. As an American, I come to Oxford and I hear, one of my first experiences here was with traffic cameras, right? So you're driving along and you think you're doing fine, and Google was giving me these directions saying, here's how you take your kids to school. Basically, you drive down to the center of Oxford, and then you go all the way around to get your kids to, and then I'm thinking, baloney. It's High Street in St. Albans. You just turn, you go right down, boom. So 2 weeks after this, I get this packet of mail, which has photographs of me in my car, my little Audi there, 30 pounds a ticket, 6 of them, because I'd gone through this bus gate that I didn't know this. So Google was doing me a favor. It was right? So I go through here. I hear later from my colleagues, some of which here at the Cybersecurity Center, saying, oh, Ivan, didn't you know that Oxford has more cameras per capita than any other city in the UK? And that, of course, as an individualistic American, just sends chills up my spine, like I'm under surveillance. I'm only going to end with this point because we have other questions to get, but when you talk about China surveilling its people, you think all these horrible Orwellian things, like look at that authoritarian regime. When you think of the United Kingdom doing it, you think, well, of course they do it. It's for traffic. It's fine, right? Really big thing there with culture and discounting. How we look at the exact same technology. A camera's a camera. It's watching people, right? Why would we assume good intentions on the part of any of the MIs or the Oxford traffic? We just generically assume good intentions, or maybe something like lucre or commerce or something. But when it's China, well, obviously, of course, they know it's awful. It's bad, So anyway, just a little point about culture to be raising. Yes, right here.
Thank you very much. My name is Stephen Patterson, and I work for a company called ARM. In case you've never heard of us, I wouldn't mind betting almost everyone in this room is in possession of half a dozen of our designs. If you've got a smartphone, you certainly are. We design microprocessors, and they're in smartphones, and they're in a whole lot of other stuff. And we have, of course, a lot of interests in the future of the internet and the digital world. I was very glad to hear the last couple of comments, which I think took the debate in a slightly broader direction. But I'd previously been inspired by Dr. Shea's reference to the spinning jenny, which started the Industrial Revolution. The analogy I often think of is actually the motor car. And I think with the internet, we're in a position now that we might have found ourselves in about 1900 looking at the motor car. I think if you had drawn up a list of pros and cons of the motor car in 1900, you would have discovered that the cons outweighed the pros. I mean, think about it. It's dangerous, the roads aren't ready for it, the horses are going to be scared, it's environmentally dodgy, it's going to get nicked, it's hugely expensive, it's going to be divisive. What does it do? It gets you from A to B a bit quicker. Come on, it's a no-brainer. Now, of course, what happened eventually was, and I can use the phrase quite literally, we devised rules of the road. And those rules of the road have allowed us to use the motor car in the way in which we now do, to enormous social and commercial and cultural benefit. And I think what we need for the digital economy is to try to find a way of generating these rules of the road. They come in different shapes and sizes. There are highway codes, there are bits of legislation, there are bits of safety by design put into automobiles and cars. And the same will be true, I think, of the online world. So what I would like to see is actually business getting together and beginning to draw up a framework for building trust. And I'm not really talking about the trust between governments, but I'm talking about the trust between people and governments, people and companies, companies and people. And this, I think, would be a major step forward. Now I come on to the subject of this session, which is cultural differences. And yeah, of course, there are huge cultural differences between China and most of the rest of the world on some of this. But there are actually also quite big cultural differences between the west coast of the United States and quite a lot of the rest of the world on this too. The west coast of the United States, mostly in the sort of high-tech sector, has a great dose of kind of American libertarianism at its core, which has been fantastic for driving the business, but is a bit dodgy when it comes to talking about principles that might build trust. Libertarians tend to be a bit wary of that kind of framework. So I just wondered, first of all, whether the panel had any thoughts on how we could set about building a kind of principle-based trust framework. Is it sensible? Would it succeed? Would the cultural differences get in the way of it? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just start with just a brief note, because I was thinking about, again, another experience about being an American in Britain is tiny compared to the United States, right? The United States had almost exactly this problem moving from the East Coast in the colonial phase to all the way to California, right? So we had to develop all of these political mechanisms and other mechanisms to get things done outside of the watch of anybody. Because when you talk about rules of the road, the first thing you think about is somebody there, some constable there, or some radar, or somebody there to enforce things. And also, it gets back to metrics. You know, what is, you know, a sort of cultural harmonization on what counts as a rule, what's a good rule, and what isn't. You know, for example, when I thought your example of the car was fascinating because I was just at Seoul a few weeks ago for the third annual cyber conference, and I remember having this awful thought that many of the panelists were up there talking about one of the enduring ideas is the economic benefits that come from the use of cyberspace, the appropriate use of cyberspace, right? And so, as part of a policy of economic development, of sharing wealth and creating new opportunities worldwide, many people, you know, both NGOs and governments, are interested in introducing the internet to places that are, you know, we would call just for cultural shorthand, benighted in some way, right? They don't have digital. So we're going to bring it. And the thing that occurred to me over and over again that's apropos of the automobile is that this is a series of Trojan horses. You know, half the panelists were talking about how nervous everybody is because we can't secure cyberspace, and the other panel is trying to give this great gift to all these people who don't have it, which is essentially, if you do the math, is essentially giving these liabilities, these vulnerabilities to people who currently don't have them, for the tenuous benefit of some sort of economic benefit later on. And this is exactly apropos of your car example, right? So you know, you could even take it less with the car and say a tractor. Let's say it's 1959, and you're going to some place where they're still using, maybe you don't even have donkeys, but you know, they're still using horses to draw things. You say, we have a tractor. With this tractor, think how much more you can do, right? How much more land you can cultivate. But of course, with the tractor, you need fuel. You need infrastructure to develop fuel. You need spare parts. You need somebody who knows how to fix tractors. You need all this kind of stuff. And the same thing is true of cyber, right? You can't just sort of give people cyber. You give them a lot of vulnerabilities and a sort of big logistic footprint along with the goodies that you get from it, right? And when you listen to this panelists at the conference very carefully, those goodies are very ambiguous because, again, this is cyber security capacity building, not sort of cyber opportunity building. You know, we're not here. There are opportunities in cyberspace. We all recognize that, and the trick is to secure without damaging opportunities. We get that, but we're nervous about it. So that's my reflection on your point about the automobile.
You know, one of the funny things about the automobile, around the turn of the century, there was a lot of discussion and anticipation that one of the greatest benefits of the horseless carriage would be that it would improve pollution. Because just in New York City alone, each day there was 2.5 million gallons of equine dehydration. So, the car was going to be this wonderful thing, but of course, it brought on pollution that nobody had ever imagined. So I think there's a similar internet security story to be told. But I couldn't agree more. My biases are that there is a huge part of the solution that is in the private sector, not just the interaction between the private sector and the government, but the interaction of the private sector with itself. I was recently at a large signals intelligence organization that will remain unnamed. They had just had a family day, if you can imagine, and they had 300 young kids in there, and they were asked to sit down and draw the internet. And they were given a bunch of crayons. And about 75% of these kids drew the word Google some way in there. So in their minds, the internet was Google, right? So, the internet is invented, owned, and operated by the private sector. So I think that's really clear. And if there's going to be, rules of the road that are put together, they either need to be self-enforcing, like traffic lights. If American drives in Britain, then he's going to pretty quickly get on the other side of the road. You've got a strong self-interest in doing that. And I think similarly, there's got to be a strong business case for trust and security to be built in. And while there wasn't a business case in the 80s or 90s, I think we increasingly are starting to see that. Ironically, it wasn't Chinese hacking that prompted Google to really start thinking hard and investing in security, although they were. It was the revelation that, their internal data savers were being penetrated by the NSA. So, and now that is having huge implications in their international markets. So, there is an emerging business case for increasing security and that increasing discussion. So I would just encourage that to keep going.
If I may, sorry to all three have to come in.
To be almost the last comment.
But no, it's a fascinating question. I think the first thing is to recognise that we are in the age of the privatisation of security. This is obviously in the internet, where the private sector, as you said, own 80 to 90% of the networks and often the trained people. Edward Snowden, that's why, private contractor. You can't, in government any longer, have the expertise you need to do the job. Governments have lost control. In other domains of security, they own the domain. They own the airspace, they own the weapons, nobody else owned them. They had the monopoly of the use. Cyber is an area where governments have lost control and therefore have to form partnerships. That's key. But we see privatisation elsewhere. Armed guards on ships now. They're dealing with pirates, police using private security companies to do investigations for them or running prisons. So this is all part of, I think, a broader debate about what the rules of the road are, good term, what the rules of engagement are. And I think basically we have to move on two fronts. And here again, I think the Oxford Centre could play a useful role. What are the informal contacts that we need? But also at the same time, as we go forward, what kind of regulations do we need? We have regulations for how private security companies operate in Iraq, when they can shoot and when they can't, and what happens if they break the rules and so on. And frankly, we do need a debate in this world. It's not going to be an easy one about liability. If something goes wrong, is it the manufacturer of the software who takes responsibility? You should have given me a better car. As opposed to, no, you should have maintained it better, or you should have driven it more securely. We're in a world where the private sector have come up with a product, but expected the government to produce the roads and the traffic lights and the highway code and the driving test for individual drivers and the MOT tests and all of that. So who is liable? One other thing that hasn't come up at all today, but is going to be important, is what is the balance between technical solutions, how we reconfigure the internet as we go along to make it less static. It's too static at the moment. We deal with mobile attackers attacking essentially static targets. So how do we reconfigure, reprogram to make ourselves less vulnerable? And then leadership is important. This again hasn't come up, but too often you go around to somewhere and you say, hey, I'd like to talk to you about cybersecurity. Oh, I'm really sorry, Jamie, but John, my information technology manager, he's on holiday this week. Come back. We need, and again, this is something I think that this place can play a role in, is making sure that leaders understand the issues. Because, as we've said, the culture is a joined-up culture. It's getting people, Department of Homeland Security to work with the Pentagon, the internet service providers to accept more responsibility, software companies to design better products, more information assurance. How do we know the microprocessors in our systems are really secure. And when you've got such a joined up kind of universe, you can't expect one minister to deal with it. It has to come from the top, because only the top can knock heads together and get people to work. And I still feel that, you know, although we've got loads of geeks and very competent experts, the problem is that there is at the strategic level still not enough understanding of the issue or engagement of the decision makers, who ultimately have to understand what they're up to, the risks, and drive the process forward. And again, as we said earlier, it's very important to decide where we need more security, but maybe where we need less security as well, with the privacy debate. But I think what's lacking, this would be my final comment, is there's a lack of a clear process. There's a myriad of NGOs, there's millions of conferences on this topic. I mean, come on, hands up those of you who have been to at least 30 cyber conferences over the last six months. There are loads of processes going on, there are loads of initiatives, there are loads of international organisations. And if we're not going to succeed, if we have this kind of, you know, proliferation of multilateralism, we need to identify a process, a structure, a group that effectively can sort of take this forward. We can't ride 15 horses in the circus at the same time.
All right. I'm going to have to draw this to a close for now. We're about to go have coffee. I'll let Sadie take over. But allow me to thank our distinguished speakers, Dr. John Lindsay and Dr. Jamie Shea. Thank you.
Thank you very much.